Today's daf is daf Chav Ches. After wishing everyone a good morning, Iboilahu. We got up to Iboilahu. So until now, we've established that after divorce, they should not be living in the same chotzer, he and his ex. So the Gemara now has a suffix, Iboilahu. So we're counting down from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. They have shutfus in a chotzer. Who has to pack out after the divorce? Tashma will decide based on a brisa. He nidches mipanov. The brisa says that, and the Gemara is going to explain why later on. She has to pack out and find herself another place to live. B'mayaskina. What's the case? The Gemara analyzes. If he owns the chotzer, then pshita. Why would the Mishnah have to tell the Bryce have to tell me he nidches? Why would he have to pack out of his own private domicile? If on the other hand she owns the chotzer, is vatanya we know from another brisa that who nidche mipaneh. He has to pack out if it's her chotzer. Elalav kahai gavna. So Gemara at this point thinks that we're talking about a case of a chotzer shel shneim. They had joint ownership over a chotzer, and now which one of them would have to pack his bags or her bags? It would be she and not he. So Gemara rejects the proof. Ilma di agir mega. We're not talking about a case where they have shutfus and they both share equal ownership in the chotzer, but rather this chotzer belongs to a third party, and they're both renting the chotzer. And in that case, we can assume that her rights over the chotzer are limited. She only has rental rights. That's not equivalent to bailus. So she doesn't have full-fledged ownership, and therefore he can push her away and force her to find another place to live. And the Gemara is going to always explain later why he gets preference. However, in a case where they're actually shutfus and they both own the chotzer, then despite it all, he can't force her to pack out. She owns the chotzer no less than he does. My havila, what's the final conclusion? Tashma. And here we're going to quote a pasuk from Yeshayahu Perek Chaf Beis. And this is when the enemies of the Jews are threatening to take Chizkiyahu HaMelech, he's Melech Yehuda, and remove him from his own palace, send him into exile. And the Navi says about those who try to attack and undermine Chizkiyahu HaMelech, Hine Hashem betaltalach, God is going to take you and move you, taltala govar, and it's the movement of a man. So basically, the Navi is warning this fellow who's the chief opponent of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, his name is Shevna, that he shouldn't be so self-confident, so, as we would say, cocksure of himself, because he's not going to remain in his place with peace and serenity, but rather God is going to move him around.
This case that we just talked about, if there's children, does that have any impact on it or not?
Let's read one more line of the Gemara, and then maybe Steve will be able to answer your question. Omar Rav, what did Rav derive from this pasuk? Il tule de gavra kashin mi de isisa. Now, I'm going to translate this Gemara. Honestly, I found this Gemara counterintuitive. And the Gemara is addressing the following question and answering the question based on the pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi. When a man and a woman have to relocate and they have to leave their familiar environs in order to find a new place to live, who finds it more difficult? To which of the marriage partners is there a greater challenge in having to relocate? And the fact that the pasuk in Yeshayahu adds these extra two words, taltalah gavar, when the Navi is warning and castigating those who are the enemies of, in this case, Chizkiyahu Melech, that they're going to suffer, he points out that it's a tiltul of gavar. It's a greater suffering, says the Gemara Rav, for the man to relocate than the woman to relocate. It's easier for a woman to relocate. Now, if you happen to have any commentaries, I was disappointed here in the Masechet. I didn't find that he added much. Let me read it again. He seems to say in the footnote that people in the new location will naturally have more compassion for a woman, and she'll be able to find a support group in the new location. I thought intuitively that maybe it means when a man relocates, it's difficult for him, A, to make new friends. It's a long process. Men are not as outgoing as ladies are. And secondly, if the man is a bread earner, he's got to find a new job. He's got to find a new employer. Now, would it make any difference with their children? I don't know. If we're speaking about Rahmanas and compassion of the new neighbors on a woman who moves in and shows up in that location to rent an apartment, it could be that Rahmanas will be extended towards the children as well. If, on the other hand, we're going with my intuition, for whatever reason you want to do that a man finds it difficult and challenging to find a new environment that will accept him, make new friends, find a job, then once again, I think that seems to be, in the Gemara's thinking, the key overriding factor that would override even perhaps the issue of the children. But you're right. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's up to Bezdin to decide how to separate, the men from the women, the husbands and the wives after divorce. The Gemara is now going to establish a very interesting principle. When a man and a woman get divorced, they should not, there are claims and counterclaims. We all know that divorce is a big mess, and they have to go to Bezdin so that Bezdin can find some sort of a reasonable solution to these problems. They should not both show up in the same Bezdin, especially if he's a Kohen. Why? Because when a former couple that are now divorced have memories, whether they're conscious or subconscious, deep in their subconscious mind, of experiences they had together, intimacy and so forth, then there's a fear that they might have intimacy. In other words, even though they're really at two ends of a table fighting over custody, over alimony and so forth and so on, nevertheless, there's an interchange between them. And it's emotionally draining, and they may at some point have an intimacy. That's why I emphasize that the husband here is a Kohen. Once a Kohen divorces his wife, he's enjoined, according to Torah law, from ever getting together with her and reestablishing a marriage relationship. Lava imenu nichse avia. Here's a court case between a husband and his ex-wife. He had borrowed money from her inheritance. She inherited funds and an estate from her father. Then he borrowed some of that money. Now he has to pay it back. She's suing him in court to regain the monies that he took from her father's estate. She's not allowed to go into the courtroom to be with him face to face, but rather she has to appoint a proxy to show up and plead her case. And the reason for this is because we're choshesh that within the whole context of this court case, and then at the end, let's say he has to pay up the money to her, that kind of interaction might lead them to an Avera. Amar Rav Sheshes, v'asu lekama ledina lo mizakina lehu. Rav Sheshes says, we should discourage them from showing up into Beis Din together. But if, on the other hand, they actually showed up, and again, we're talking about a Kohen and his Grusha, so they showed up in Beis Din, what do we do now? Do we send them running and packing their bags? Says Rav Sheshes, lo mizdakinan lahu. We're not going to judge them. They're not allowed to do a joint face-to-face judgment, and therefore come back with a shliach. Not clear to me who has to appoint the shliach. Obviously, it's sufficient if one of them, either he or her, I don't know who's going to have to do that tircha. My intuition again tells me it's the tovea. The plaintiff, in this case the isha, she would have to find a representative, a lawyer, or some sort of a proxy to stand in trial against him, against her ex, in her place. Rav Papa Amar, Rav Papa even adds something beyond Rav Sheshes. See, Rav Sheshes spoke about a situation that was forced upon Beis Din. They came in. What should Beis Din do at this point? Rav Papa is going to turn the clock a little bit back and ask the question of, would it be that it's prohibited for them to even show up into Beis Din together? And if they violated that prohibition, if it does exist, what would be the repercussions? And Rav Papa Omar, not only do we not judge them if they showed up, but shemute shamtinalu, the very fact that they came into Beis Din together, each one to put forth a claim or a counterclaim, that itself is a violation of the prohibition that the rabbis instituted against the ex coming together with his ex or her ex into Beis Din. And therefore, for violating that decree of the Chachamim, they get nidu. And it says lahu in the plural. My impression is that both he and she had violated this Isur D'Rabbanan, and therefore they both deserve Shamta. Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua Amar Negude Nami Minagdinon Lahu. Not only do they deserve to be put into Nidui, and Nidui usually lasts for 30 days. It's kind of like Avelus, the Menudo does not wear leather shoes and probably won't get a minion in the Beis HaKnesses, but, being a Menuda is a halbaktar, shall we say. And Rav Yeshua, Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua went a step further for violating the prohibition that was instituted by the Rabbanan. We're going to give them Makas Mardus, which, although it's a little bit easier, lighter than Makas Doraisa, but nevertheless, this is serious corporeal punishment. Rav Nachman, Tana, we learned in a Raisa, be Eva Rabbase. Eva Rabbase is a collection of Raisos that we know as Masechet Smachos. And in that Raisa, Rav Nachman found that it says, Bamedvar Murim, when do we say that a woman has to send a proxy to represent her in Beis Din after the Gerushin? That's Kishnis Garsha Min Nesuin, which means that the husband and wife before the get had already had an intimate relationship, intimacy. But if there was no intimacy, it was just a formal legal kinyan of Erisin, and then they got divorced, is nifras al yidei atzma, ein libo gasba. She can show up al yidei atzma without any representative. No one has to plead her case. She doesn't have to send a proxy, because we're not afraid of intimacy. They don't have any memories that would stimulate their appetite, because there was only Min Erisin and not Min Asur. Ika Diamri, we have now a second Lishna regarding this dialogue between Rava and Ravada Bar Masna. Lo uki Rava shliach bein tayu. Rava, when a case came in front of him with both he and she after the divorce, He didn't require any shliach whatsoever. And who argues against him? Amalei Rav Ada bar Masna Nekumar Shlucha Ben Tayyib. Why don't you force at least one of them to appoint a shliach? Amalei, so Rav responds, but Amar of Nachman, Tani Biavo Rabbasi. We have the Bryce of Tani Biavo Rabbasi that only after the Nesuin is there a requirement that they send a proxy, but not after Eretz. So in the case of Niskashim and Eretz, there's no chash. We're not worried at all that they would have this intimate relationship. In this particular case, which came in front of Rava, as we saw at the beginning, Ahu Arus ve'arusaso. Amalei Rav Ada responds to Rav, and he says, Hani mili. When do we say that if there's a get, but it was only mina erisin, therefore there's no chash? And they don't have to set up a proxy, they can show up in Bezdin. It's Hani mili. Heicha de lo gaisi bada. Aval Hani kochazina lehu de gaisi badadi. Ravi, you can't make a flat statement, unqualified, that after Erusin, if there was a get, they can show up in Bezdin together. It really depends upon the relationship that they have. How do we know whether they have some sort of intimate relationship, even though they were divorced mina Erusin? So that's called kritos uremizos. You can see the way they interact, and you could put your finger on the pulse based on the way they wink at each other, and they make other kinds of sounds and signs. You can, unless you're deaf and blind, you can see, you can feel the thickness, the closeness of their relationship. And again, it's very odd because we're talking about a situation that ended up in get. And this leads us to the Mishnah, V'elu ne'monim lahoi b'godel masharo b'katnusam. So this is a very famous Mishnah in the annals of Eilus. And we know that, for example, a katan is pasal laha'id, and that means that if the re'iyah of the Eilus took place when he was a katan, he cannot testify, even though now, a few months later, he's a gadol. We cannot allow him to testify based on a re'iyah. We have an equation between re'iyah and haggadah. Just like haggadah requires a gadol, so too re'iyah. And it's got to be what's called chilasa b'kashrus v'sofa b'kashrus. Now, our Mishnah is going to say that a katan can testify when he's a gadol on that which he saw when he's a katan. And that's against all the principles that we know in Hilchos Eidus. So there are one of two ways of going here. One way of going is to say that all the Eidios that are listed, I think there are 5, are all D'Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan made a kula, and they allowed for a gadol to testify based on what he saw when he was a katan. So that's called Hema Amru veHema Amru. Means if the Rabbanan created the psul and they disqualified a apostle, they could turn around and say, no, under these circumstances, we'll accept the apostle. So then all the 5 cases that we're about to learn in the Mishnah are all Eidus D'Rabbanan. The other way of going is to differentiate between 2 categories of Eidus. There's Eidus on a Maisa HaMachayev, a Maisa Kinyan, a Maisa Avera, maybe a Maisa Vachilas Truma in the case of testifying on someone that he's a Kohen Kosher. That's your classic Eidus on a Maisa. Then there's another kind of Eidus, another category of Eidus. And that's Eidus Hakara. A Chaf Reish He, which means to recognize the identity of a person or an object, and so forth. You're not testifying on any Maisa. You're able to see and recognize. When does the Torah give us restrictions and requirements and standards for who's kosher lahayid? That's only edus on a Maisa. But if the edus is just hakara, I think to some extent, again, I wouldn't equate them. It's what we call a modern contemporary law, an expert witness. Now, the expert witness doesn't know that Reuven killed Shimon, but the expert witness will tell you that the bullets that were shot from this gun had the capacity to murder someone. And sometimes, the science leads us to such a sensitive question that we need an expert witness, somebody who's an expert in the field. Not to equate this to that, but there's a certain similarity. So case number one, Neman Adam Lomar Zektav Yodot Shel Abba, Zektav Yodot Shel Rebbe, Zektav Yodot Shel Av. I can testify from what I saw in my younger years when I was a katan that this is my father's signature, this is my Rebbe's signature, this is my brother's signature. And we'll believe him, even though he's testifying on that which he saw when he was a katan. Number two, Sachar Hayisi Biplonis Sheyatza Binuma. There's a dinu dvarim in Bezdin as to whether or not this woman who's married to this man was married as a basula and she gets ksubas masayim, or was she already a ba'ula? Now, one of the ways, and that was the first mission in this parak, that you can prove and establish beyond the shadow of a doubt that this was the first marriage for her, and she gets ksubas masayim, it's called yotzeis binuma. And she goes out with this very, very sophisticated, beautiful crown over her head. Now, a katan is the last person around, now he's a gadol, to testify that she was yotza binuma. Virosha parua, a first marriage girl, is allowed to expose her hair. All of these testimonies establish her identity as a basula, Yotzeis Binuma and Rosha Parua. Now we go on to case number three. So we had the case of Ksav Yodo, Shal Abba, Shal Rebbe, Shal Ach. We had the case of Yotzeis Binuma. Now we have the third case. Shahoya ish ploni yotze mi beis hasefer litbo lecho betruma shayacholek imanu alagor. And I want to testify about this person that he is a Kohen. And I can testify based on what I saw when I was a Katan. And what I used to see is that this person would leave the Cheder, which is called Tinoko Shabeis Rabba Tashbar, and he went into the mikveh. Again, we're talking about a young child, and he ate truma. Now, his father is apparently not around. Because otherwise we could establish the identity of the child based on the father. But all we know about this son is that he went into the mikveh in order to eat truma. And not only that, when they divvied up the truma to the Kohanim in the Goren, he received his portion of matnas kahuna. And we're going to accept the testimony of a gadol who is testifying about what he saw as a katan. This particular case in the Mishnah would seem to undermine our second shot. Because if we're differentiating between Doraisas and Drabanans, then we may say, all right, we'll allow him to eat Truma D'Rabbanan. In Chutz La'aretz, all Truma is D'Rabbanan. But if we're going to say that it's a fundamental difference between Hakara and Edus on a Maisa, Here, the Hakara is what you'd call a Davar Shebe'erev. I mean, we wanted to find his personal status, his personal identity, make him into a Kohen Kosher. For that, we should certainly require Edus Gemura. Now we get up to case 4. Hamakom hazeh beis hapras, meaning a Kohen is not allowed to go into this area because in this area there was a dead body that was buried, and they did charisha to this land, which means they plowed the land. And we're going to assume that there is an etzem min hames scattered all around this field. So that's called a beis hapras. It's called a sada shenechrash ba kever. The kever itself was plowed into, and the bones of the deceased, of the skeleton, of the corpse, are now spread out throughout the sun. And this former child is testifying that he remembers in his youth, this was the Beis Hapras. There was a big sign that says, Kohanim are not allowed, like in Shari Tzedek Hospital, you know what I mean? If somebody dies in the hospital, Kohanim are not permitted to enter the hospital. And finally, the last case is the Ad Kana Yisi Hayinu Boim B'Shabbos. If you leave the outskirts of the city, you're only allowed up to 2,000 Amma, and he identifies that location where the 2,000 Amma ended and didn't extend beyond that. And once again, it's Edus Hakara. It's not Edus on a Maisa Machaya. Aval Eino Dom Neman Lomar. Okay, now the last case that we're about to, by way of introduction, is a Momenos case. In other words, we're going to establish, based on the testimony of this former child, based on what he saw when he was a child, the ownership rights of a certain piece of land. That's already Dini Momenos. And if you ask me, I would say that this last case is the biggest chiddush of all the cases that we had until now. Because he's going to say, Derech Hoya Leploni B'Makom Hazeh. Like, let's say you have a field and it's surrounded by other fields. In order to get access to the inner field, you need a green light for that. You have to communicate with the Alta Zaken, the, what do they call them here? The Dod Zaken, Sabarab, and all that stuff. And you've got to find out exactly where an owner would have access to go down a road in order to get to his field. Do you follow what I'm saying? So you have a field that's surrounded by other fields, and now a person is claiming that he owns rights to cut through this field to get to his field, because they left out that derech, that shtickle karka from the sale to allow him to facilitate his access to his field. And then there are going to be all sorts of debates about where the boundary was, and did he have such an agreement or not. And the Mishnah is saying that a gadol is allowed to testify on what he knew and what he saw b'katnuso. And the Mishnah says, Haval ein. So the fifth case of the Mishnah is Ad Kan Hayinu Boim B'Shabbos, right? We have the 2,000 Amma. This is where we stop walking on Shabbos, up until this tree, right? There's a tree over. But in the last case, we're not going to allow the Katan to testify now as a gadol on what he saw as a Katan and tell us about the exact boundaries of a field which is apparently under contention, under debate. And this would be Hamotzi Mechavero Olav Haran. This is already Dini Momenos. Amar Rav Huna Berei the Rabbi Yoshua. Sheyesh Gadol Imo. Rav Huna has a tremendous qualification of our Mishnah. When the Rabbanan were Mekil and they allowed Edus on what he saw as a katan, they only did so under the condition that there's another aid who was a Gadol when he saw it, that links up together with this katan Chanasa Gadol. So it means that if there were two witnesses, because we required two witnesses, that testify about what they saw in their katnus, we could not accept that aid. Okay. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah mentioned recognizing the signatures of father, Rebbe, brother. Why do we need all three? Utzrif. Diashmin of he's very familiar with his father's signature. Even as a child, he's very often present when his father signs something. Aval Rabo, how often does he see his Rebbe sign a document? Lo, we shouldn't believe him. So I need the Mishnah to tell me Rabbo. Now let's ask the other way around. The Iyashmin and Rabbo, if the Mishnah had omitted Aviv, this is a fascinating Gemara. I always get amazed at the psychology and the sociology and the biology of the Gemara. Here's another case of psychology. He says, Mishum de Islay a Mosa de Rabbi. A student wants to imitate his Rebbe, has a tremendous amount of awe for his Rebbe. He's going to watch carefully how his Rebbe signs a document. And he's going to try to emulate that. And this reminds, from time to time, I get called upon to be Masechet Kedushin. And when it comes to the Ksuba, I ask the Eidim to sign each one separately on a page. So that I want to make sure that they're signing it properly, which means the father, and if the father's a Kohen, and there are 1,000,001 questions that come up that has signed a document. So this Talmud is carefully scrutinizing his Rebbe, watching how his Rebbe signs a document. Aval Aviv lo, he doesn't have this awe vis-a-vis his father. That's Mora Rabcha. And he doesn't meticulously watch the way his father signs the shtar. So why does the Mishnah feel compelled to tell me Achiv? And the answer is Aviv the Shchiach Kabei Rabbo de Masolav Aval Achiv Leslie Loha V'Loha Emo Lo Kamash Balan, that we believe this former child who testifies that he saw his brother sign shtaros when he was a child, meaning he's coming to testify about his brother's signature. He doesn't have any of these advantages. He's not shchiach, and certainly it's not a musal. So that's the chiddush, that he can always testify on the chasimos. Now it's interesting, the Mishnah mentions only three. There are a heck of a lot of other possibilities. But it seems from this Mishnah that if a katan who now became a gadol was called upon to be Mekayim Shtar, meaning to authenticate the signatures, and he admits that he only saw the signatures in his youth before he became a gadol, he would not be believed. The only reason he's believed in our Mishnah is because it's a close relative or a rebbe. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know, wait a second. This is the first of a list of 5 cases where we allow the testimony of a gadol based on what he saw as a katan. Let's set the record straight. Why? Why are we accepting such aidus? We need tchilaso b'sofo b'kashus. Tchilaso means at the time of the re'iyah. And the Gemara says, Kevan de kiyum shtaris midrabanan and nu rabbanan midrabanan. Again, it's this application of pesha of Haim Amru veHaim Amru. The Rabbanan required Kiyum Shtaros. The whole enterprise of Kiyum Shtaros is a rabbinic convention, and they will tell you who to believe in the process of Kiyum Shtaros. Zachar Yisi Beplonis Sheyotze B'Numa Rocha Parua. My timer. Why is he believed when it was Tchilasa B'Paslas he was a katan? And not only that, the Gemara is implying that since what's at stake is the value of the ksuba, whether or not she gets the ksuba's masayim, then it's dinei mamanos, and we should always apply the principle of hamotzi b'chaver of raya. So how then could we rely on edus psula on a doraisa level to be motzi mom and mikas kasa? The answers came in the Rav Nashim Psulas Ninu Gili Mil to be almahu. The truth is that the Torah would certainly assume that she's a psula, because most women who are getting married, it's the first marriage. We really don't need any testimony of Yotzeis Binuma Rocha Parua to establish that she's a first marriage. But the Rabbana were machmir. Okay, so all we need is a Gili Milsa. Now again, it could be that Gili Milsa Ba'alma is what we touched upon before. It's Hakara. You know, you're recognizing the person. Right now, it's an anonymous person. And then the Mishnah says he's believed to say Shaya each pony yotzim base sefer lipo lechol truma. So we're going to allow this person to eat truma based on the testimony of someone who's a gadol now and saw that he ate truma when he was a cut. Frek the Gemara, Vidilma Eved Cohen, who, how do you know he's a Cohen? Maybe he's the Eved of a Cohen. And then it's Kinyan Kaspo and he eats truma. Misayel Rabbi Yeshua Ben Levi, in the light is a statement, the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua Ben Levi can answer this question. The Amar Rabbi Yeshua Ben Levi also liodem shel yelamed es avdo Torah. It's impossible to even suggest that this man is an Eved, because his father used to take him to study Torah. He can't be an Eved. And if he's not an Eved, he's a Kohen. And he can eat Truma. The Gemara rejects it below. Are you telling me that an Eved is excluded from Talmud Torah? But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Lova Imenu Rabo. If unfortunately the master had such financial pressures that he had to borrow money from his own Eved, Oshaso Rabo Apitropis,